Before we dive into today's episode, I've got some exciting news. FutureLab, Australia's first longevity supplement range, is now available at Chemist Warehouse and leading health food stores. Now, this is a lot more than a regular supplement range. It really is a mission. And the experts at FutureLab have developed formulas designed to support your well-being today, tomorrow, and beyond. Welcome to FutureLab, where we explore the cutting edge of health span and well-being. I'm Danny Urbinder, and with me is my co-host, nutrigenomist, geneticist and nutritionist, Dr. Denise Furness. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
That's fantastic. Look, we've got something that's actually probably close to your heart. Today we're going to be talking with Dr. Elisa Song about how health span, the foundations of that are actually laid not just at early life, but we're talking at conception and preconception. So I'm sure that's something that's certainly been of interest to you over your career as well.
Absolutely. That's actually where I started. So in the first 10 years of my scientific career in genetics and epigenetics was looking at preconception health and pregnancy and working with DOHAD, so the development origins of health and disease, which is now called health. We sort of knocked off the disease, but it is so important at these early stages for increasing or decreasing risk of adult onset disease. And I'm sure that we are going to hear a lot of that from Elisa, who is really a world-renowned integrative pediatrician. I feel very lucky to have known her and presented with her with work that we've done in the past. And I was in the US at a conference, the IFM conference, Functional Medicine Conference, and I told Elisa about our new podcast. I said, we're launching a podcast on health span and longevity. And she said, well, it all starts, in utero, in those early childhood years. And I said, do you want to come and chat about this on the podcast? And we are very lucky to have you here today, Elisa.
So welcome. Dr. Elisa Song. How are you?
Thank you. I'm so excited. I wish I could be there in person, but I will just have to wait for my next trip to Australia.
Well, we certainly look forward to that too. Well, look, let's jump straight into it. But before we go into the topic that we just discussed, you are an integrative pediatrician. So that's obviously an unusual area. You don't often hear of that. So how did you get into that, and what sparked your interest and led you down that path?
I am fortunate that for many physicians who kind of embark on a functional integrative path, they've done so because of a health crisis, maybe for themselves or for a family member, and conventional medicine didn't have all the answers. And so they had to look outside the conventional medicine box. And, for me, knock on wood, I didn't have that story. And so I really started my pediatric career knowing that I wanted to do more integrative functional medicine work. I didn't know it was called that back then, right? Because I this was back, I finished my residency back in 2000, so I've been doing this now for over 24 years. And back then it was called alternative medicine, right? Or maybe holistic medicine. And when I was an undergraduate, a university student at Stanford, I actually didn't even want to be a doctor. I wanted to be a lawyer. I thought, I know I want to work with kids. My passion is to help kids to be, live their best life. And I was going to be a civil rights lawyer, and I was going to work on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and fight for poverty rights and, increasing the Medicaid poverty line and working on teenage pregnancy and all of that. And I did that for actually a couple of summers as an undergrad. And then I realized, there's something else that I'm really meant to do, because I want to work with children, not just for them. And, life happens the way it should. And it was just at that moment that I stumbled across a flyer for the American Holistic Medical Association. And I'd never heard of holistic medicine. And I thought, well, let me check it out, because my mom was a doc, and I'd always thought, well, maybe that's something that I could pursue. And my mind was blown. This is in the late 80s. And it was when folks like Andrew Weil, Deepak Chopra, Joan Borisenko, they were just starting to become known. And I remember coming out of there and calling my mom, no cell phones back then. It was, we had to do the rotary dial, and calling her and saying, you know what? I think I want to be a naturopathic doctor. And she immediately was like, what is that? and she never discouraged me, but nobody at that time knew what that was. I mean, now we have so many great naturopathic schools, and I have so many naturopathic physician friends, but that took me down the path to then pursuing medicine, going to conventional medical school, but always dissatisfied and wanting to do something different.
Right.
So that's where I sought my own education after residency and opened up my practice.
Fantastic. But it sounds like there was an interest in children right from the very beginning. So what sparked that?
When I was a kid, and thinking about what my future career was going to be, it was either going to be a pediatrician or a veterinarian. Because I always wanted to work with little people, right? Little creatures, and my first love was actually going to be a vet, and I had this vision of living in a barn and having, kind of like Noah's Ark, having every single kind of animal in the planet living with me in this barn, taking care of them.
Sounds like my daughter.
Not such a huge leap to going to children. I mean, I loved babysitting. I loved, lifeguarding and being a counselor. And so I don't know. I don't know what sparks people to, at a young age to love kids or decide, kids aren't for me. But it was clear as a child that I always wanted to work with kids.
Wow, that really is. Look, you do exude that quality. So you saying that is not surprising, but it is interesting that right from the very beginning, that was where your interest lied. Well, let's jump into the topic at hand anyway. So we are all about health span. We want to explore what are the influences that ensure that we live not just a long life, but also live as healthily as possible for as long as possible. And when Denise mentioned that she got in touch with you recently, she mentioned that you were, well, it sounded like somewhat excited to talk about the fact that health span really starts not just at birth, but at preconception. So what are the influences at preconception that at least lay the foundations for health span?
Well, and this is something that is such an important topic to talk about, because now in the functional medicine world, we have all of these biohacks. I mean, everyone wants to know what's the next biohack so that I can improve my longevity, improve my health span. And we want to think about the fact that way back, even as far back as 2005. There is a New England Journal of Medicine report, now this is almost 20 years ago, that stated that despite our medical advances and for the past centuries, our lifespans have been improving. For the first time in history, we are at the point now where our children are expected to have shorter lifespans than us, their parents, almost exclusively due to diet and lifestyle-related diseases, right? 80% now of deaths worldwide are really, really attributable to non-communicable diseases. I mean, what are those? Those are diet and lifestyle-related diseases. And so, we don't want our children to have that future. And when we think about what the foundations are for longevity and for health span, you're right. It starts even long before they're born. And it starts preconception. I mean, we must think about how we're going to help future parents lay the foundations of health for their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren, because all of those epigenetic influences passed down for generations.
Yeah, and we're going to get into those epigenetics. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I mean, so when we think about what those influences are, I mean, there are so many. I mean, for me, it's always about the microbiome, right? we have to start with their microbiome, and the magic happens in the microbiome. But then there's so many factors that influence microbiome health, and in that sense, mothers and fathers' microbiome health going into conception, and mothers' microbiome health in utero during pregnancy and during birth, and her vaginal microbiome and her breast gland microbiome. So, I mean, we can unpack a lot of that. So I don't know where you want to start with that, but there's so many factors that we know affect your baby's future health, and also that we have the power as parents to change. I mean, that is where the empowerment piece comes in, because it's not enough to say, well, we know these factors, but these are almost all of these factors we have influence over. we can change. And that is the power of epigenetics. It means that our genetics are not set in stone, that we may have these genes that we're born with that put us at a higher risk for a variety of certain conditions, but nothing is set in stone. We have so many points of intervention that we can influence our epigenetic outcomes.
Yeah, sure. Do you want to ask
I-
about the epigenetics?
Yeah,
side
I'd
of
love
it?
to.
Yeah.
And I guess, when you think about the epigenetics, so as I said, I was involved in that sort of DOHAD sort of research consortium, and it really started back with the Barker hypothesis and learning that children that were born during certain things, like, certain famines, I think it was the Dutch potato famine, then also in Ireland, they found that there were epigenetic changes. Well, back then we didn't know it was epigenetic changes, but they just realised that these children were more likely to be obese, more likely to have metabolic disorders, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease. So that really started, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Elisa, I think that was maybe 1995 or something, mid-90s, we started realising this link between what happens with the mother in utero, stresses, nutrient deficiencies can impact the health of the child. And then obviously since then we've learned so much now about the molecular things, the epigenetics. But can you tell us a little bit more about these particular epigenetic changes? I've just mentioned about, nutrient deficiencies, but other things that can impact epigenetic changes, as well as the microbiome. I'd be very happy to hear more about that, and not just the gut microbiome, vaginal and the breast.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's so fascinating when we think about epigenetics and the developmental origin of health, right? Doe had health and disease, but when we're pregnant, the in utero environment that our babies experience set the stage for them to adapt to the outside world postpartum. But depending on what that postpartum world looks like, they may be adapted to that or not. Right. So, for example, with the potato famine, or there's another more recent, the Project Ice Storm that looked at one of Canada's worst, national disasters, where during these times, those babies that were inside in utero and were adapted to a state of famine, to a state of nutrient depletion, then became adapted to live in that kind of world, to be able to thrive in a world with scarcity. And then you can imagine them being born nowadays into this world of overabundance.
Excess
We're not
food.
adapted to that.
Yeah. They've developed in an environment, and like you said, exactly, adaptations to help them survive. These things are to actually help survival. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It is meant to be a helpful thing. But the reality is now we live in an environment that is, quite disconnected, and there is an abundance of food. And often that food is high calorie, low nutrient dense as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And, one of the things that really I think about with these epigenetic changes, I love that you said it's not good or bad. It's how we're adapting. It's a process that is meant to help us thrive if the conditions remain appropriate, right? But as we think about, I always think about the effect of prenatal maternal stress, psychological stress, and now we're finding even the impact of paternal stress on your baby's epigenetics. And this is not to blame any mother. I mean, so the other thing I always kind of tread lightly on is because when we think about the epigenetic mechanisms that occur during pregnancy, it's so easy then as a mom to go back and think, oh my gosh, it's my fault that my child now has eczema or anxiety or an autoimmune condition or PCOS or whatever else is going on. And we have to understand, we start from a point of what we know, and we only know what we know at the time. And so now all of these epigenetic changes that occurred in utero, they can still shift, right? We can still change our epigenetic future. So that is something that's so important to understand. We need to understand first what some of these forces are, but then also know, look, your kids have the power too, if we educate them to make these epigenetic changes for the better, right? Even if you're in your 30s or your 40s or your 50s, we still have that ability to change how our genes are working for us or against us. And I talk to kids about that a lot, because I have so many kids in my practice who, let's say, everyone on mom's side has diabetes and everyone on dad's side has anxiety. So of course I'm going to have diabetes and anxiety at some point, right? That is the attitude for some adolescents who say, well, why should I bother? Why should I bother watching what I eat or how I'm living? Because I'm going to get anxiety. I'm going to get diabetes. Like, everyone in my family has it.
Sorry, can
right?
I just contextualize that then? So I'm just thinking, in my case, I grew up in a household where my father was a chain smoker, and my brother and I were exposed to constant smoke in the house. I mean, it must have been disastrous for our health. Now, there would have been a lot of epigenetic changes that occurred as a result of that exposure, I imagine, putting me at risk of certain diseases later on in life. Are you saying that I could influence my epigenetics now to reduce my risk for those diseases even in my 50s now?
Well, that's what we're seeing, right? That's what we can do when we measure things like telomere length, and when we can look at your biological age versus your chronologic age. I mean, we know it is possible to turn the clock back. Right. And hopefully we can do that, at younger and younger ages, or understand, the processes that keep the clock from turning faster. And then for children too. I mean, if we can empower them and educate them now about the diet, lifestyle changes that they can embrace as their future lifestyle, and their current and future lifestyle, then they won't have to think about, reversing their biological age and trying to sort of age backwards.
Which some of us are doing at this point in time. So I really like that you mentioned about not wanting to make mums feel bad, because as someone who understands this in depth, when I had my first pregnancy, I developed Graves' disease. Excuse me, and I really couldn't eat very much until about 27 weeks. I had constant nausea. I was very sick. I wasn't diagnosed until I was quite late. But the point is, it was a very rough pregnancy. Then when I did eat, I probably ate worse food than I'd ever eaten in about 10 years. I was starving. So I was in a very weird place. Danny, we've talked about it before. We did a podcast on it. But I was so concerned about my future child, because I understood the influence in utero and epigenetically, and I was so concerned for my son. And long story short, he's absolutely fine. There were some, in the early days, I was worried about some developmental things. He didn't talk until he was a bit later, very sensitive child. There were a few things, but he's now 12 and he's thriving. And I want to say thriving academically, sports, soccer. So these things, even though I had, I would say, one of the worst pregnancies, I almost lost him at 27 weeks. That's how I ended up getting diagnosed finally. And I was in thyrotoxic shock and went on medication that you're not meant to have when you're pregnant, all that kind of stuff. But the reality is, through relatively good nutrition, we're not perfect, but, love, kindness, a good environment, these things can undo some of those potentially negative so-called epigenetic changes. So there is so much we can do, because sometimes there may be people listening too that have had a trauma or something in their pregnancy that you can't control. So there's no point getting stressed or worried about that, because that doesn't actually set you up for healthy aging for you or your children either. It's just about doing what you can now and knowing that we can actually undo some of those things if we start getting on track with our diet and lifestyle.
Yeah. Well, and, when we think about prenatal maternal stress and psychological stress, I mean, that too, we know, so many, it's so intertwined. I mean, psychological stress can disrupt your gut microbiome, trigger zonulin release, which is a marker for leaky gut, within 1 hour. And then think about if you're living in a situation where it's perpetual stress, whether it's job stress or partner stress or poverty, food scarcity, whatever it is. And we also know if there are ways that we can support your gut's microbiome, all of those polyphenols, right, those phytonutrients, the color in your diet that, as long as you keep it down, right, not too nauseous, that the color in your diet will support your microbiome and your microbiome's ability to use those polyphenols with their genes to support our genes, right? It's this amazing synergy, the symbiosis that we have. And in turn, your beneficial microbes will produce the short-chain fatty acids like butyrate that also help with our and our baby's epigenetics and will help produce some of the nutrients, all of those amazing methylation cofactors like, your B12, your B9, and your choline. Many of those are produced by your gut microbes. So if we think about, okay, well, what's one thing that can help shield our child, protect our child, improve their epigenetic resilience when they're born, it's really supporting our gut microbiome to support ourselves with the nutrients that we need to properly, methylate and do all of the things that we need to for proper epigenetic programming. Even, there was a recent study, right? Because I always say it's, we know it's not just about the mom because everything's put on the mom, right? The mom's microbiome, how moms ate, all the psychological, exposures and toxins that mom was exposed to. However, there's a recent study that came out that father's microbiome before conception, okay, could impact and had a significant relationship with affecting babies' growth during pregnancy, so correlated with growth restriction and low birth weight, with worse birth outcomes, and even postnatally after the baby was born, associated with poor growth after birth, and even premature mortality after birth. So really supporting.
How so we've got a father that has a suboptimal microbiome, maybe doesn't eat well. How does that all translate to all of those effects that you just mentioned?
And if I can just jump into the microbiome, but also the epigenetic things we were talking about as well, like when you were talking about, because we do have a lot more information about the epigenetic changes in men, like in sperm cells, more than women. It's a bit harder to be getting out the egg, the ovum. But we know that men that are obese or that are smoking tend to be more likely to have a child with smoking. They may be more likely for childhood cancers. If they're obese, their child's more likely to be obese. So there's definitely those influence. So the microbiome, but then also epigenetically different genes are being turned on. Like we said, this adaptation. Yep. And with the growth restriction, as Elisa just said, for people to understand if a baby is truly growth restricted, this can have impacts on organ development and actually physiological changes in that child that then could result in a number of things that are going to impact their health, metabolic diseases, things like that.
Yeah. And there was even one study looking at grandfathers' microbiome. And we know, the state of your microbiome is absolutely going to impact how epigenetics occur. It's interesting too. So I have to, and maybe Denise, this is something that you can answer because I've had a hard time wrapping my mind around it because you have the sperm and the egg that come together, right? And they have their own sort of epigenetics that they bring with them, maybe different methylation. And then, once they come together in those early stages, there's almost like a wiping of the slate. There's demethylation that occurs. And then it has to happen all over again, right? And so, even if, so that tells me, in my mind, what that tells me is even if preconception, maybe, you or your partner aren't entering into the pregnancy in, the best health possible, there's still many opportunities during pregnancy to impact what's going on from that developmental and epigenetic standpoint.
So if the mother does
mother
does improve her health during pregnancy, that will have an epigenetic influence on the baby as it's developing. Is that what you're saying?
Even preconception, like what Elisa was just saying about that total. We have this demethylation. There's a couple of genes that will be methylated, but basically there is this total demethylation, and that's a really critical time point because the body needs to be able to produce enough methyl groups, which come back to what you said, Elisa, the B9, the folate, the B12, all the methyl donors. So that's why we talk a lot about, folate, important during pregnancy, preconception. But the mother needs to have enough of these nutrients to then lay down all of those methyl groups for all of that cell division. So it's a really critical time. So the mum and the dad are important, but that early stage of pregnancy, when we do get all that remethylation, is absolutely critical.
Well, and just to think about this is all kind of maybe seeming esoteric, but let's take the example of supplementation, with your folate, with your B12, with your choline, which is so important for fetal brain development. But, there's a famous mouse study looking at, there's something called the agouti mouse that's really famous, right? And, in an unhealthier state, these mice become obese, metabolically unwell. They have kind of a yellow coat. And then in a healthy state, they're slim, they have a brown coat, and they're healthier, right? They're metabolically healthier. And so there was this one study that took these pregnant mice and genetically identical and fed, I think through IV, they exposed these pregnant mice to bisphenol A, right, which is an endocrine disruptor. And we know that we are surrounded, ubiquitous endocrine disruptors, these forever chemicals that are really everywhere and unavoidable. So when they did no intervention but the bisphenol A, those pregnant mice gave birth to the heavier, metabolically unwell yellow mice. When those pregnant mice were exposed to bisphenol A and also supplemented with B12 and choline in B9, they had healthy mice.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
So same genes, these were identical pups, but different outcomes. Because epigenetically, those babies were supported by mothers being supplemented by these nutrients. So, there's so much that we can do. And this is where, thinking about, these forever chemicals that are found, in cord blood, in the placenta, in breast milk. What can we do to support that? Well, one of the ways we can support that is supporting methylation by optimizing, methyl donors that pregnant women, get through supplementation through their food. And we always want to use food as medicine first. And then even as we are born and our kids, get older, we want to make sure that their diets are replete with all the nutrients that they need to support their epigenetics.
I'm so glad you brought up that study. So the very first publication was 2003. In the Cell. So it was Randy Jertel and this is Waterland and Jertel. They're the two authors that came up with that agouti mouse model study. And it was actually a little bit scary for all of us. I was doing my PhD at the time in epigenetics, looking at folate, B12 in pregnant mothers, and we were first understanding that these interventions were having major epigenetic shifts that could be passed on not just to the babies of that mice, but future generations as well. And then it was a few years later they came out with that paper that you described with the BPA. So BPA, as we now know, is removed from plastic. So we see BPA free. And we know now that BPA does increase risk of developmental disorders, particularly in boys, being an endocrine disruptor, mimicking estrogen, but also cancers. But what BPA does is actually rips off methyl groups. It changes those epigenetic patterns. So when you then supplement these mice with something like a methyl donor, it compensates for that chemical or toxin. So you're putting in a toxin that can cause damage, removing methyl groups that should be there, but then you're bringing in something so that they can compensate. In saying that too, though, for the listeners, it doesn't mean you need to go and overdose on B vitamins, because I've had some people come to me then and think, wow, and I've discussed this research before, and then people are sort of overdosing on folate and B12. It's not necessary you need to go and have high doses of these things. More so try to reduce your exposure to these chemicals and toxins, and then maybe speak to a practitioner if you want to supplement, or don't go and think that high doses or excessive supplementing is the way to go.
Well, I'm so glad you said that, because, really, many of the dosages that are found in prenatal vitamins, many of them are based on animal studies. And so, I think, the good prenatals now are going to use, methylated Bs and have really good amounts of choline. I think there's the best evidence for choline supplementation during pregnancy. But there are some, as I was doing the research on what supplements and what dosages for pregnant women, there were some interesting studies that looked at folate supplementation in the first trimester could potentially, at least in this one study, was correlated with an increased risk for wheezing, reactive airway disease in the babies up to maybe 1.5 years of life. And so, that's not to say don't take your folate supplementation if a prenatal has been prescribed for you. But again, everything in moderation. And it's really really hard to overdo things with food. So make sure that you're eating your dark green leafy vegetables and, you're getting in all of your amazing food sources first. I mean, that's going to be the priority because there's such synergy in the nutrients of food that you're not going to get from just taking isolated, vitamins or minerals from different food components.
Yeah. Look, that's interesting. But one of the things that I did want to touch on, again, that you've mentioned a couple of times, and that is the influence of telomeres. So my understanding is that when we're born with a certain telomere length. They're the protective caps at the end of chromosomes, which perhaps you can explain in a bit more detail. But I'm interested to know, well, what influence and I suppose to what extent do telomeres determine our health span and our lifespan? And can we have an influence on that as well?
Yeah. So, I'm going to just say I'm not an expert in telomeres because that's something more on the other end of life that there's been focus on how can we increase telomere length. And, that is a biomarker for, health span. It's something that can be measured to as we're trying to support and optimize longevity. But we're born with a certain telomere length, and we know that prenatal factors can affect telomere length. And in fact, it's interesting when babies are born with a certain telomere length, again, the cap at the end of their chromosomes, the telomere length actually has been found to rapidly decrease in the first few years of life. So, and then reach a kind of a stable pattern through adolescence. So, presumably then, if we would like to have longer telomere lengths as we age, then we want to start off with them as long as possible, right? I mean, that makes sense. And, diet can prenatal diet can affect the telomere length that your babies are born with. In fact, I was looking at one study that found that a Mediterranean type diet can improve telomere length in your offspring. Psychological stress in the mother can reduce telomere length. And we have to think now, I'm just thinking about all those COVID babies, and, we know the impact of adverse childhood events, and we know that there's been some thought that maybe through the pandemic there's been some IQ loss that we're now trying to catch up on. But, really that the effect of prenatal stress and early life stress also impacts how your babies and children respond, their cortisol stress response, their HPA, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal thyroid axis. And I'm seeing so many kids at younger and younger ages with adrenal issues and thyroid issues that really we think more of as an older phenomenon, things that children should not have to face. And even there, right, when we think about psychological stress, and the pandemic is something hopefully we will never in our lifetime ever repeat again. But what's fascinating is when they looked at, I mentioned this Project Ice Storm, in Canada, where they also found that babies who were born to mothers who were pregnant during this ice storm, where food was scarce and, power was out, the cold. This is one of the harshest winters in Canadian history. And those babies did have a higher risk for mental health concerns like schizophrenia when they were adolescents and, diabetes and metabolic health concerns. One of the factors that seemed protective, they looked at the mother's objective hardship, right? And many mothers objectively had very similar hardships. And then they looked at their subjective hardships. And what was fascinating is that the subjective experience had a more profound effect on the outcomes for your baby. So those mothers who subjectively felt like, okay, this is tough, and yet maybe there are some silver linings, or it's not as bad as it could be, or it could be worse, right? Those mindset shifts that we can have, they really do make a difference. And that is something that I talk to kids about all the time. It is how we perceive our life and perceive our stress. So perceived stress is just as important as objective stress. And we can do something about the perceived stress that we have. It's a work in progress always, but meditators, were found to have, different methylation patterns after meditation, practicing loving kindness meditation, gratitude, EFT, emotional freedom technique, and tapping.
So if you were a meditator and you noticed that it had certain epigenetic changes that resulted from that, what genes is it affecting, and how does that translate physiologically?
I'm gonna look here because I actually did. I was so fascinating. I wanted to see exactly what genes were differentially methylated, and there are actually several that were found in this one study of meditators. And also, they looked at telomere length. So one thing that looked at, I mean, this is not necessarily going to make a lot of sense to listeners, but they had differential DNA methylation at specific subtelomeric regions containing the GPR31 and the SERPIN8B9 genes associated with telomere length. I mean, that's fascinating.
That's so
right?
Meditation
can improve your telomere
can
length.
help you at least reduce your risk of a shorter telomere over time. So by meditating, you're actually influencing an important aspect of longevity and health span.
But also your ability to handle stress. So you may recall we had the guest Ryan Smith.
Yeah.
And so he does a lot of work in that space from True Diagnostic, looking at epigenetic methylation changes. And that's what I was doing the study with, his tests last year. And he has the biggest data bank, biobank database of epigenetic changes. And what they've found is that meditation seems to be one of the most profound treatments, if I'm quoting him correctly, because he was actually saying he needs to do more of it. But meditation had a huge impact, and it was changing the methylation, the epigenetics of those glucocorticoid receptor genes. A lot to do with the stress response. Stress response.
I mean, that's astounding. So meditation alone,
It's
we're talking about your mindset is able to change your epigenetics to the point where physiologically the genes associated with stress hormones are turned off. And I imagine there are a whole bunch of, and telomere length as well. So it has a profound influence on our whole body to influence health span and lifespan.
Well, and it's a telomere length. It's also, Denise, as you were saying, it's really, it's our glucose insulin response, our lipid metabolism. I mean, just so many, our inflammatory pathways. I mean, so many things can be righted through, really harnessing that power of meditation, engaging your vagus nerve, really understanding that it's not just kind of an optional, I'll do it when I have time, but it must be one of the I think it's one of the most important prescriptions we can really teach our children as they head into adulthood.
Have you ever wondered what a healthier, stronger future you might look like? With Melrose FutureLab, Australia's first longevity supplement range, you can now optimize your health span routine by supporting cellular energy, metabolic well-being, and muscle maintenance, as well as much, much more. And you can find this range at Chemist Warehouse and leading health food stores.
Elisa, I have just had a flashback. When you came to Australia, you were on stage and we were speaking. Danny had actually organised the event. This was many years ago. And as someone who does a lot of public speaking myself, I know that I get a little bit, I'm not in that parasympathetic, which is that relaxed state. I do get a bit in that sympathetic drive. I mean, I love public speaking, but I get nervous, heart rate. Now, you were on stage and we're at a TV studio with a live audience being recorded, and you did the heart math. You connected the little device to your ear, and it's called heart math. I don't know it in detail. You can explain it. But you showed us your results, and you were up there being filmed at a TV studio with a live audience. I was watching you, and you were in that what we call parasympathetic state, that relaxed state, not high cortisol, not adrenaline, while presenting. I can't believe I haven't asked you this for the last 8 years. What is your trick to get into? Are you meditating while you're on stage?
She took a high dose of L-theanine before she went on stage.
How do you get yourself? Because you're obviously someone who is very good at regulating your stress response. So I'd love to ask for you, but then also, before we finish, too, a little bit about what you do with the children and the teenagers, because we've talked a lot about pregnancy. But before we talk about how to help manage the healthy aging epigenetics in children and teenagers, how did you get that heart math result in such a great parasympathetic state while presenting on stage in that environment?
Yeah, you have to practice it, and that's just the bottom line. Your parasympathetic, your vagus nerve, I mean, it's like a muscle that has to be exercised, but it has to be exercised every day throughout the day, because we have every single day. I mean, for listeners, your autonomic nervous system, that's your automatic nervous system. We have very little control over a lot of it. And so the sympathetic part is what people are all too familiar with, that fight, fright, or flight, or freeze response, where, I mean, that gets triggered in an instant for most people. You know, the morning started off, the kids were fighting, and you're kind of yelling at them, you're late to school, and then you have an important work meeting, or your kids, they have an exam, or maybe they got a really mean text from a friend or saw something awful on social media, right? I mean, we're always kind of jumping into this fight or flight state. And that is a normal physiologic response. I mean, stress is not, quote, bad, but prolonged chronic stress, that is what's not healthy for us. So, you know, when we have that stress response, our parasympathetic nervous system should kick in to say, hey, okay, that saber-toothed tiger, that proverbial saber-toothed tiger, it's not here anymore. So now you can just relax sympathetic and you get into that calm, rest, digest, restore state. But if we don't practice that, we're always in this sympathetic state. And so it's just taking that moment to, now what's fascinating is the one thing we can control in this sort of automatic nervous system is our breath, right? We can control our breath, and our breath is the direct line to your vagus nerve. Because you can't sit here and tell your heart to beat faster or your stomach to digest slower. You know, we don't have control over that. But simply by slowing down our breath, holding our breath on the inhale, using our diaphragm fully to expand our lungs, and then exhaling slowly with our diaphragm, exhaling completely, that then tells your vagus nerve, let's kick in, let's get into that parasympathetic, and let's now stay in that calm state where we have optimal heart rate variability. And that you can learn how to, I mean, we have to breathe anyway, right? I mean, in my book, I talk about, I mean, there's a whole chapter dedicated to your vagus nerve and breathe, because if we learn how to breathe in the right way, if our kids do, they can get into that parasympathetic anytime they want to, no matter what's happened, no matter how mean their friend was, or no matter if they have a presentation in front of their classroom. And that heart math, what that does is, when you have that electrode on your ear, it connects to an app on your phone, and it's a proxy. It measures whether you're in a state of coherence, whether you have good heart rate variability. And the way I explain that to kids is, you know, you can find your pulse on your neck or on your wrist, wherever you want to, and then you just slow your breath down and take a slow breath in. And you should notice as you're breathing in, your heart rate increases, and as you exhale, your heart rate slows down. That is good heart rate variability. Your heart rate is varying with when you breathe in and when you breathe out. And so as you practice that, you can do that. You can get into that state anytime. So when I'm nervous, I always get nervous before speaking, right? But then you just slow your breath down and you just engage your vagus nerve, and you can then stay in that state while you're talking or while you're taking an exam. And that state is a state that many people call the flow state. I'm in the zone. It's what athletes will do before they, start their tournament. So as you get into that state, we become much more creative, much more open, much more calm. And so I think that's something, if we can really help our kids learn how to engage their vagus nerve, epigenetically, that's going to methylate many different regions of their genes that influence their metabolic health, their hormone health, their nervous system health, their mental health. It's going to help support their microbiome, because improving your heart rate variability optimizes your microbiome independent of diet. And so, in our fast food, ultra-processed world where our kids are, going out and buying all sorts of junk whenever they get a chance, helping them learn how to use their vagus nerve every day mindfully can help to counteract all of those. And that even toxic stress and environmental stress is going to be protective.
I mean, what you're talking about is obviously a feature of meditative practices that have been done for thousands of years. But I think what you're saying is it's something that we should be mindful of just during our day to day, we should be aware of how we're breathing as a way of ensuring that we, at least when we're feeling stressed, we can go back to that parasympathetic state. Is that the practice that you're referring to?
Yeah. And I don't even call it meditation or mindfulness because, a lot of kids, at least in the States now, many schools have a class, a socio-emotional learning class where they'll do some yoga, they'll do some meditation in class. And it's often the class that when kids are, when I ask them about school, they kind of do the little eye roll like, oh yeah, I get to go to sleep for, a little bit, right? Unfortunately, mindfulness meditation has been kind of put into a different, like a woo-woo realm, like, oh, it's not real medicine. So, I let them know this is vagus nerve exercises. This is vagus nerve work that we need to do just as much as, you work your muscles or, you work your focus muscles. Whatever it is, this is really, it's something that we want to put on the realm of what we need to do every day, and just as or probably more important than any supplement I can recommend. So the kind of food as medicine and, vagus nerve work, mind as medicine are the two priorities.
I talk to my patients about self-care snacks. Now, I developed that from my good friend Paul Taylor, who's going to be on the podcast very soon. He talks about movement snacks. I don't know if he came up with that or someone else, but movement snacks. So, you're not sitting all the time, a little bit of exercise in between. And it was a big part of our healthy aging study last year. But something I've recently just started introducing is self-care snacks. And really, it's just about a couple of deep breaths in between meetings or work or after you drop off the kids, because there is so much power in that deep breathing. And I don't call it meditation. One, because I'll disclose I don't think I'm a very good meditator. I would like to develop that skill, but we can all take 10 seconds to just do a couple of deep breaths. And like you said, Elisa, people are in this constant sympathetic drive. The stress as they wake up, I've got this on, it's kids and I've got meeting or blah, 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 or whatever it may be. Even if they don't have children, they're just stressed by the day. Or they're just starting the day off in this state and often in that state, until bedtime. And that really is a cause of chronic health conditions. That causes accelerated aging, exactly what we don't want. So these self-care snacks, I'm calling them, is just about during the day, having a few moments, whenever it is, just to take a couple of deep breaths, just slowing down, being in the moment, giving your mind a bit of a break. Now, I've not read your book yet. However, I do feel very privileged and special that I was the first Australian to get your book.
Should we say what the book is?
Yes. So when we're in the US, when we were in the US in June,
it's coming to Australia. It looks just like this.
Healthy Kids, Happy Kids, fantastic. Yep.
Yeah, Healthy Kids, Happy Kids. But I have children, and thankfully at this point they're young, 12 and 7. They're doing pretty good. We live in a beautiful part of Australia. I feel like we're a bit removed from some of the things being in the Noosa hinterland. But I think this is really important for all of us. And even you saying you've got a chapter on the vagus nerve, even for the adults, for the parents, for everyone, these things are so important. But yes, I'm glad that you reminded me about the book and you've got a chapter in that, because I do need to read that book.
Well, and, I will say, I don't know what being, good at meditation is, but if we had to rate it on a scale, I'm probably terrible at it, because I sit there and, you can only sit for so long before I start to feel like, oh, I need to start doing something else. So, literally, I start the day with, it's a 5-minute meditation on a free app called Insight Timer. And I will have kids who have phones and parents download the app right when they're sitting right in front of me and bookmark that 5-minute meditation. And I let them know, you do this, start the day with this, or if you're, in the parking lot on your way to school and you have those 5 minutes, anywhere you can, but do it once a day. And if you don't feel like you have time for 5 minutes, it's because you really don't want to. It's because you don't yet understand the importance and the power of it. But, starting every morning with that 5 minutes, it's like my way to reset for the day. Or, if you, want to reset later in the day. But
But you do
It can be done in
feel
5
you do
minutes.
feel the difference that it makes to your day if you start the day with that meditation. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. When I don't have that time, which unfortunately, now with the kids' school schedule, they're getting up early, and so I don't have that quiet time often before the hustle and bustle starts. But I can definitely notice the difference. I notice the difference in my patience with what's happening in the morning, how we get out the door. Is there going to be screaming and crying, or is it going to be a smooth exit, to the car? Also, starting the day when I get to the office, am I just focused and, open up some tabs and start doing the work? Or am I kind of frantic? Oh my gosh, I have so much to do. And do I want to do this? I have to do that. And, moving from place to place. So there's a certain, what's the right way to phrase it? A stillness in the busyness that it imparts to the day, which makes such a difference. And I feel like, we're all busy. Our kids are all busy. So if we can find how to be a little bit more still in each day and present in what we're doing. There was one study, I believe it was a Harvard study, but they I don't even know how they surveyed this or analyzed this, but they found that I think 95% of the time we are thinking about something else than what we're actually doing, right? Like even as we're sitting here, my mind flitted to, I have to pick Kenzie up for soccer, at some point, right? And the more the mind wandered, the lower the happiness scores. The lower our happiness scores, the worse our methylation is going to be. I mean, the worse our microbiome is going to be. So a wandering mind was found to really be an unhappy mind. And so it's cultivating that ability to be present and mindful in the face of, social media calling and texts and group threads constantly pinging. I mean, it's something that we have to work extra hard at for our kids nowadays. And that power of connection. I mean, of touch, of community. I mean, that we know through the pandemic how much that loss of community impacted not just mental health, but physiologic health. And I mean, Denise, I know you know all the studies, but there was that one study of pups, right? These rats who were either isolated from their mothers or had a lot of licking, grooming behavior, basically the hugging and kissing and touching that we would do with our babies. And those pups who were touched and kissed and loved, they had differential methylation. I mean, they had improved health outcomes because of that. So, the power of love and touch and, just being, in community.
Yeah, lower cortisol levels, didn't have the same anxiety, so not just the methylation, but talking about the outcome. They were calmer pups, mice, into adulthood, whereas those that were removed from getting that, I guess, grooming, they call it grooming, but it's similar to hugs and kisses, actually were more anxious, stressed, high cortisol levels being that stress hormone. Can I ask you, Elisa, aside from doing your 5-minute meditation in the morning, what do you do to take care of your health? Now, I know sometimes supplements can change, but at the moment, do you have a supplement stack? What's your favorite, your biggest hacks for taking care of yourself to set yourself up for healthy aging?
I would say my number one priority is sleep. I mean, more than any supplement. And, I'm not a regular supplement taker. I take supplements here and there. I will say my two favorites that I take on a more consistent basis are my SPMs, so specialized pro-resolving mediators, to help regulate immune response, and CoQ10. I mean, those are the two things that are more regular in my supplement stash. But sleep, there is nothing that, I mean, I'm not going to say nothing. That's kind of dramatic, but there are very few things that can restore your health like sleep can. Right? I mean, sleep and exercise, I mean, all these things, but sleep. I mean, sleep is when your brain actually shrinks by about 60% to be bathed, by its own lymphatic system, the lymphatic system, to clear away the wastes, all the toxins that you were exposed to during the day, and bring in some nutrients. For kids, I let them know your brain is releasing most of your growth hormone in your sleep. Like literally your kids are taller overnight. It's not, you didn't just imagine it. And so your blood sugar, insulin response, so many things will fall into place. So that's probably my biggest, it's not a hack necessarily, but it's over time, especially as I've tracked things like heart rate variability with my Oura Ring. I can absolutely see resilience scores correlated mostly with sleep.
Well, I'm glad that you said that, because I did have that question on the list and I was worried that we were running out of time. And I recognize how important sleep is. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that. Having been an insomniac for the last 2 years myself, improving though, I can testify to just how important sleep is and how it affects every aspect of your health. It is profound compared to anything else that we discussed today. And I've certainly experienced adversity like anyone else in this world, not sleeping. And it's something that I'm thankfully getting over now. Not sleeping has been the most impactful thing that I've experienced in my life in terms of my health, in terms of my mood, my ability to be productive, my ability to have relationships with people was affected by lack of sleep. Yeah. So I think it's one of the most profound, just from personal experience.
You've got your Oura, I've got my Whoop band, and I love traveling internationally. I get to catch up with amazing people like you, but it really knocks me about. And because I am so focused on healthy aging, I am considering next year being a little bit more selective with the amount of travel I do, because it does have a big impact on, we were talking about this earlier, not just my sleep patterns, but my desire to exercise, my food choices. And so I love these events. But yes, sleep for me with my HRV, and I can feel it. For those that aren't tracking on these things, their stress and their sleep and their HRV, you can just wake up and say, do I feel energized? Do I feel fresh? Am I ready to start the day? If you're not, then you probably need to work on these things. Alcohol's the other thing for me, Elisa. Someone who has loved a drink throughout most of my adult life. And I've really cut back on the alcohol last year, doing the healthy aging study, tracking so closely, doing the biological age epigenetic testing. Alcohol is, it's definitely something that is not good for my health and most people that I work with as well.
Yeah. Well, I have not been able to find this reference, and I don't think I made it up, but I remember reading, eons ago, this one study that looked at driving, things like fine motor control, and I think this was really in driving, and looked at people who were sleep deprived versus people who had maybe one glass of wine, and the reflexes of the folks who were sleep deprived were worse than the folks who had an alcoholic beverage. So, just in terms of, think about how many people are sleep deprived, just, driving on the highways every day, and, the tasks that we're called to do, and how much clumsier you are if you really pay attention if you're not sleeping well. And, sleep, the sleep microbiome relationship is fascinating too, because it just takes 2 days, so 48 hours of sleep deprivation to disrupt your microbiome to a more inflammatory pattern. On the other hand, it takes 7 days to restore that. And so, we want to be on a consistent pattern of getting optimal sleep, so that, the times where we are, of necessity or not, sleep deprived, then our microbiomes have a better chance to bounce back. And then improving your microbiome does also support healthy sleep, because your microbiome makes something like 400 times more melatonin than your brain does. So oftentimes, when we're having some sleep issues, like for kids who come in and they're having sleep issues, or parents are asking about sleep, sleep disturbances are so common in kids and adults. And so, we always start looking at their gut first and seeing, can we optimize those microbes that are supporting the neurotransmitters that optimize sleep and mood, like serotonin and melatonin and, GABA and acetylcholine.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing there's a lot more about this in your book as well, looking at the gut microbiome as well. And I think what you were leading to just then too was really that word resilience. because there will be times that we may not sleep well on the odd occasion traveling, or you might go out socially or for whatever reason, but we want to have enough resilience so that we are eating well, sleeping well most of the time, looking after our gut microbiome, etc., that we can tolerate the odd time where we are not, sleeping so much. But I really appreciate everything that you have said, and I look forward to seeing you in person. Hopefully you are going to be back in Australia very soon. Danny, have you got any final questions? Yeah, I know. We need to bring you over.
Yeah, we certainly don't want to hold you up on picking up Kenzie from soccer practice. It is Kenzie, is that right? But before we do let you go, it's traditional of us, because we are a program about health span, and the last question that we like to pose is, if you did have an extra 10 years of life than what we have on average, let's say, how would you use that extra 10 years? What would make it meaningful to you?
10 years of healthy life. Yes, feeling good, functioning with your body and mind.
Yeah. I mean, I love to travel and experience different cultures and different foods. So I would spend those 10 years traveling every single nook and cranny of the world. I mean, that would be my dream come true if I could really explore all that, our ecosystems have to offer, the cultural diversity. I mean, that would be amazing. I'm trying to do that now, with my kids and really share that. But
yeah, and not when you're working. See, for me, I pop over, I'm working, and then I come straight back, enjoying your time while you're traveling,
Yeah.
A bit more relaxed.
Sure.
Yep,
and if people want to
absolutely.
find more about you, the resources that you have to offer, certainly sort of learn more about your book, how can they find that?
Yeah, well, actually in Australia, the book is going to be available on Amazon, so really easily at the end of October 30th.
Fantastic.
And then you can find out more about me, how the different information, the different classes that I give, or just my online blogs on my website, which is healthykidshappykids.com. And then on Instagram is where I'm most active, and that's healthykids_happykids.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Elisa Song, thank you so much for your time. We could have literally gone on forever because there's just so much to cover, but thank you so much for that fantastic information.
Thank you, Elisa. We'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.